Good morning to all of those joining. This is part two of a webinar that started last fall in between Dan and I. Dan and I met about a year ago, started talking about GRESB and biodiversity at the very kind of beginning of how that was shaping up. Last fall, we talked about things that were upcoming, and we were talking a little bit more hypothetically. Today's webinar is kind of exciting because there's actually some pretty concrete stuff that have changed, and we're going to go through some of those elements today. So we have a good webinar today, and hopefully we'll give you some concrete insights and be a little bit more into kind of tangibles. Dan, anything you'd like to say before we start off?
Thanks everybody for joining. Biodiversity is the emerging topic within GRESB. Well, within ESG, right? And then GRESB is the tailored approach for institutional real assets, real estate and infrastructure. So we take those ideas that are out there that are meant to advance the industry, to advance business and the capital markets, and we infuse them into the assessment in order to figure out who's good, better, best, what the metrics might be, solutions that are out there, and help everybody move.
Okay. Great. So we'll go on to the next slide and do some quick agenda. So we're going to talk a couple of intros. We'll talk about biodiversity, as you just said, Dan. Right? It's an evolving topic, way beyond commercial real estate. Our focus will be commercial real estate, but we'll just talk a little bit about how it is kind of changing a lot of the kind of the ESG sector as a whole. Go into GRESB specifically, some of the changes and the criteria there. We'll talk about TNFD, very important acronym in the world of biodiversity. So it's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. We'll talk about how GRESB is aligned in a certain way with TNFD, which is kind of the global framework. And then we'll try to finish off on a few practical indicators that the commercial real estate sector can use to measure biodiversity. So we're going to start pretty large and try to end up on something that's actually pretty tangible. So that's the plan, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Let's go and do some introductions. I'll start here myself. So I'm Alex McLean. I'm the CEO and the co-founder of Alvéole. We've also been on a bit of a wild ride for the last 11 years. It's been a lot of growth. Started with, as any organization start, as one location with our particular service, to now 2,200 and growing by many hundreds every year. I personally started working with bees when I was about 15 years old with my uncle, who was a beekeeper. So kind of happened by accident. Never thought I would be in the world of bees. Always was interested in sustainability, but not necessarily the world of bees. And about 11 years ago, with two other partners, we started Alvéole, and has evolved into servicing essentially only the commercial real estate industry because it's a perfect kind of match. We want to change cities. We want to make them more interesting for nature and biodiversity. We want to get people more aware about why nature and biodiversity is important in cities. And if you want to do that, you have to do it with people that own land in the cities, right? That's where you can affect change. And so the relationship with the commercial real estate industry, we stumbled on it, but it became a very important one. See a couple of the customers that we work with at the very bottom. If some people are joining from these companies, we're so happy to have you as customers. We're so happy to have you as partners. And if you're joining from one of these companies, then you probably are used to kind of our flagship product, which is the bees on the roof, or the wild bees on the roof, and an engagement program, which is very important, very successful in with the buildings and with the entities that we work with. But over the last 2 years, with the world shaping up around biodiversity, and some of the first questions that popped up are how we're going to measure biodiversity if it's something that's important. But we started investing a lot of energy, a lot of time, a lot of resources to develop a platform and a way to actually measure biodiversity in commercial real estate. So we're going to touch on that a little bit, but that's why we're here today with GRESB is because it's something that we're doing in the space, and I'm sure there's a lot of customers that are already joining that have already looked into this with us. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how that links up with very important benchmarks like GRESB. I think I've said enough about what we do. Oh, and we work across the US, across Canada, and across 6 different countries in Europe. So yeah, throw in the chat where you're from. It's always nice to see where people are joining in from. So that's Alvéole. That's me. It's Alex. Dan, I'll send it over to you.
If you caught a little bit of the banter that Alex and I were having as we were getting ready to let all the folks in, I'm Dan Winters, Senior Director at GRESB. I've been with the organization for 10 years. GRESB has been in existence since 2009. It was started as an academic research project at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. And it was a couple institutional investors got together and they said, coming out of the great financial crisis, boy, that was rough. And we're seeing some of our fund managers with the annual reports showing these LEED buildings or BREEAM Excellent, LEED Platinum, Energy Star. This is really cool. What are all of our other fund managers doing that aren't showing us those kind of buildings on those annual reports? What are they doing when it comes to sustainability? And so they came up with what I'm going to call an ESG due diligence questionnaire, 2009, 2010. And it was a great research project. Got a lot of traction in the institutional real estate industry. And somebody at APG said, this is great. Let's do it again. And so the next year they did it and more respondents happened. So 15 years later, GRESB has evolved and changed to become the North Star for the institutional real estate industry and infrastructure when it comes to sustainability. Capital markets call it ESG. And we've grown 15 straight years up and to the right with participants, with progress, and with impact. So I've been with GRESB for 10 years. I'm a finance-oriented person, and I'm kind of the skeptic when it comes to these new things that show up. So in 2016, we had a health and wellness module. So at GRESB, and this is where like the skepticism of Dan comes in, because this shows up. I'm like, wow, how's the real estate industry really gonna move the needle on this? And so we had a module, and they typically live for 3 years, right? First year we asked 10 questions. The second year we refine those questions. We see what the participants do. The third year we might score some of those things just to give them, how did you do on this module? And then we infuse it within the assessment. We did the same thing with resilience. That was before TCFD. And so now here we are. So we've been successful there. TNFD, biodiversity, big topic on the radar of institutional investors. And so if you look at the GRESB Foundation, which governs the standard, you will see where the roadmap is going forward. I just did a search of that document. Biodiversity is listed in there nearly 40 times. So it is a hot topic with institutional real estate, but it's an emergent topic. People don't really know, what does it mean? What can I do, right? So my job at GRESB is my job is forward, right? And be kind of out there. I bumped into Alex about a year ago and we had this conversation and it was great. And so we committed to doing a couple webinars because I knew that this was also moving forward concurrently within the GRESB Foundation. So with that, that's a little bit about us. We're this ESG benchmark globally. Great year last year. Just some metrics here: 2,223 portfolios submitted to GRESB. That covers 210,000 buildings in nearly 80 countries. So we're having an impact helping the industry move forward on structured non-financial data. And besides some of these new topics and webinars, I'm also working on the lender side, the debt side, the yin to the yang of the equity assessment. So those are some things that are happening at GRESB as we hit the middle of the decade.
And you mentioned some of the kind of founding members, right, or founding companies that said let's put this benchmark together, and APG being one of them. APG still very much ahead of the curve and has actually committed to some nature related risk disclosures also for this upcoming year. And so as part of this kind of general conversation, interesting to see that some of those companies are still kind of leading the charge on some of the more cutting edge stuff, which is great to see. Okay, so before we go into GRESB per se and the kind of changes to biodiversity, we'll just kind of talk a little bit here about the broader kind of focus on biodiversity. On the top of this call, maybe Dan, I'll throw it here to you. You've mentioned this as kind of a bigger thing that's emerging around ESG. Can you talk to that a little bit and see how you've seen biodiversity evolve, or how you're seeing it today?
Yeah, well, right. So it's this emerging topic. So I'm going to put two things in the chat here. First is, just TNFD. If you haven't seen it, there it is. There's the website, and it's the About section. What grabs me is this: sorry for the bullet. The opening statement on the website, right? Society, business, and finance depend, and that's a key word, depend on nature's assets and the services they provide. It's the dependency that's often taken for granted. So GRESB's job is to, so much time and effort is focused on the financials. Oh, leasing velocity and IRR and NPV and NOI and all of those things. Great. Well, what about the non-financial side? And all of those, metrics and efforts and things that go into how the financials came about. This is one of them for sure. So same time, it's Mother Nature. It's complex. There's tremendous complexity. So right now, we're in the early stages, just like we were with those other modules. What does this mean to you? And what GRESB is great at, because we have all these members globally, is we put questions out there, and then we see what the answers are, and we're able to continue to refine them. What we're looking for is good, better, best practices around the globe, so we can pick those things out, highlight them, and others can see that those might be good ideas for their circumstance and their business objectives.
Yeah, and TNFD is the big global framework that's coming out, right? And so great to throw it in there. And I love that you actually quoted that, because that's the whole idea of TNFD, is the idea of double materiality. And so the dependency on nature, but then also the impact on nature. So a commercial real estate building obviously is dependent on nature to be able to be built and to have access to the resources so that it can actually be constructed. But then it also can impact positively or negatively biodiversity over its operating time of operation. And so TNFD is a framework that essentially kind of covers those two angles, so you can see how you're dependent on nature and how you're impacting nature. And yeah, it's not a soft thing. It's a very hard thing that has very tangible trillions of dollars associated to it, right? And for those that are just new to TNFD, TCFD, right, which obviously shaped a lot on the kind of climate disclosures. This is the same group, and so the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is, a task force, a global task force of financial institutions and scientists and a lot of people in the space that have agreed to a certain way to disclose and the right indicators in order to benchmark nature in the same way across all these different industries. And they also have identified industries that are more material than others and have given specific guidance to that. And so the real estate industry has specific guidance from TNFD that was put out just at the end of last year, which has very clear indicators and very clear metrics. Something that we hear sometimes when we talk about nature and biodiversity is, how do you measure it, right? Like how do you get a sense of, such complex things like nature, right? You can't just, it's not like carbon emissions where you can put one single number to it. And TNFD has done the work to actually do that. So to those out there that think we can't measure nature and we don't have the indicators, it's not true. Those indicators exist. We're going to touch on them a little bit at the end, and we're going to touch on the way GRESB is aligning also the criteria which aligns with TNFD. So it makes it all simple, where it's kind of coming all from the same place, right?
So Alex, just to be, I'm here to get educated a little bit on these metrics. I've been poking around in advance of this webinar. Obviously, the group in Amsterdam has been working on this, and they're involved. So from my perspective, I'm here to learn too. So do us right.
Yeah, well, we'll get into that. We have a slide where we actually look at those indicators. And then there was one last thing I'll say here, just to talk about the big players in the biodiversity sector. So we talked about TNFD, kind of global framework. COP15, which happened a couple of years ago, is where this biodiversity framework, where 196 countries got together, and again, a little bit more large than the real estate sector. 196 countries that got together and said, by 2030, we have to have a lot of stuff done for biodiversity. And some of the elements in there, obviously, it's much larger than cities or real estate. It touches on the entire world. But some of the big areas of focus were urban centers. So how can we make urban centers better for biodiversity, support biodiversity, and the kind of awareness that comes out of that? And another big piece was corporates. How can corporates participate in biodiversity, both in the kind of disclosures and then in the impacts that they have? So that's the much larger aspect. There was a bunch of other agreed upon objectives between the 196 countries. And TNFD is kind of the framework to help put all that together. Let's talk a little bit about GRESB, and you can educate us a little bit here on what's happening for 2025. And you can touch on a little bit on the timeline on how these things happen. So we have on the screen here, this is the kind of evolution of the standards coming into 2025. Well, I'll let you take it away, Dan, and kind of touch on the kind of main aspects. We've obviously outlined biodiversity or highlighted biodiversity here, so you can see how it's showing up. But for a second, we'll just talk about the other criteria that are coming out in 2025 to put that in context a little bit. Right?
Great. 4 buckets, 7 issues, right? And so I draw first the attention to the 2 right side columns, the reporting impact and the scoring impact. Lots of X's on the scoring impact, couple check marks, right? So the way that GRESB works is when you see something in the assessment that is unscored, this is a signal, it's an advance. And what we're doing is we're taking the pulse of the marketplace. We'll get to the question that we're doing on biodiversity in a second. But we put something out there, it's unscored, we see what happens when it comes back. And all of this filters back through the GRESB Foundation, which owns and governs the standard. So it's not like, the handful of us on this call can get together and come up with some new things and then throw it out there in GRESB. There's this whole process that takes place. And it's a multi-year change process. So let's kind of go down the list here of what this is. So we're giving some recognition for energy efficiency, even outside of the building certifications and Energy Star and whatnot. So based upon how well the property is doing compared to the larger data set within GRESB, you can get positive or neutral points and taking away the like for like. There's some real specific guidance on how this works that's listed in the change document for 2025. The point that I'm trying to make is that this is going to be positive for most everybody because it's going to take the pressure off the like for like and put it more on what are you doing and is your asset great? Awesome. You're going to get credit for that. Second thing is residential, right? GRESB is a blunt force instrument that applies to all property types, but the circumstance on the ground is a little bit different where you say live and sleep versus where you work, shop, and play. So having the residential sector have a couple tailored questions for those circumstances is an advance for 2025. Renewable energy, we're trying to parse out, and this is not where I know the specifics. So know that we're doing some things on renewable energy to deal with RECs and market-based versus just all of the issues around renewable energy. So we're trying to advance that forward. We've heard the market to say, we need better, more refined metrics. So that's happening. Building certifications was something we tried to do this year. What we're hearing from the institutional investors, from the LPs, is, hey, we've got some assets that are coming in 6, 8, 9 different certifications on these buildings. And we're kind of concerned that might be too much. And so then, what is also the value of a certification, say, B of A Tower in New York City, LEED Core and Shell 2007. Okay, that's 17 years old. It's nice that it had that LEED certification. That's great. But having a LEED existing building certification from 2024 would be way more valuable. So the idea is to amortize based upon length of time in the marketplace, these building certifications. So we made an advance last year. It had some interesting consequences. We pulled that back, but the market's on notice that building certifications is an area within the performance section that's getting a lot of attention, and we'll see some changes going forward. Embodied carbon is an emerging topic, as is biodiversity. So a lot of research is happening on that. Some questions will be showing up. And it's a little bit more applicable to the developer assessment or the developer component within the real estate assessment. And then the last thing before we get to biodiversity, just getting to the streamlining the whole reporting structure, right? We're taking out certain indicators or trying to streamline those to make everybody's job more efficient and be able to put more time into making things sustainable rather than telling everybody about what you did. Biodiversity, emerging topic. There's going to be a question within GRESB. Let's see it. Let's go to the next slide. There it is. So pretty simple question, unscored. Do you have a strategy? And the entity, this is a loaded word within GRESB. An entity could be a publicly traded REIT where we can all buy a share through the stock exchange in that REIT. Private equity fund where you have LPs, the big institutional investors. That fund is an entity. A separate account, an entity. A JV, that's a legal structure, even a single building, entity. Does the entity have a strategy that addresses biodiversity and nature-related issues? Yes or no? All questions in GRESB, Boolean, yes or no? If yes, tell us about it. If no, move to the next question. I observe that when people answer no to questions, oh boy, do they want to get to yes the next year. So here we are. There's the question. What do y'all think? Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, for us in the biodiversity space, we think this question is fantastic. And it's fantastic, not for the first part that you just mentioned, but actually the second part that you didn't mention, which is the nature-related strategy consider dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And the reason that's important is that's referring to TNFD's LEAP framework. And this is part of the documentation that GRESB put out. Alongside this particular new criteria is saying, we're going to align with TNFD. That's the framework that we want to align with. But the interesting piece is not just is there a strategy, because there are a lot of organizations out there that have started putting some level of strategy around biodiversity. A lot of our customers, actually, probably some that are on the call, that have some level of biodiversity strategy. What's missing there, it's not a huge gap, but it's missing, is how do you consider those dependencies, those impacts, those risks, and those opportunities? And that's the concept of double materiality that we were talking about earlier. How is the building, dependent on nature, and how is it impacting nature? And so therefore, what are the risks? How do we mitigate those risks? And what are the opportunities that the building can take to actually, positively impact nature? So it's a really interesting and couldn't be better worded in kind of the first foray into biodiversity for people. And so I can see a lot of entities, as you said, Dan, this year that will be able to actually say yes to this question with a little bit of additional work to include those dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities.
No. So there's this. The other side of GRESB is we definitely do not want to GRESBify the world, whatever that might mean. So that's why these questions are out here in this way. So we're going to hear from people in Finland and people in Norway. They have a different circumstance than people in Brazil. They have a different circumstance from Malaysia. So all of these folks are going to see this and they're going to respond. And that's the beauty of this. So the whole idea is to identify best practices, good, better, best, along the institutional real estate spectrum, and then help the industry pick those things out and move them forward. One other point here is that if you go on GRESB.com, the hero image on the homepage, two things: the 2025 GRESB standards updates and the GRESB Foundation roadmap. So the first one is the assessment changes that I put in there, that URL. The second one, and I'm sorry I did not title it, but it's in the URL, the GRESB Foundation roadmap. I strongly encourage people to take a look at this. Sometimes GRESB is accused of not communicating very well. We are doubling down to communicate as much as we can. Hence why I'm also, geeked out on this webinar. And so the second URL was published December 2024, the Foundation Roadmap. It is hot off the press. It's an exceptional communication piece. It's everything you want to know about where GRESB is going over the next 3 to 5 years. And I really encourage you, if at minimum, read the preface from the board of directors, and it talks about the purpose, the theory of change, and why GRESB exists.
And you said when you did a search, biodiversity showed up 40 times, right? It's a
little less. I forgot the exact number. Right. So it's in there for sure.
Well, thanks for sharing those. And then I know you can't commit to any of this, so it's more just to talk through that green not scored section, I was on a conversation with one of our customers last week, and we were talking about this particular thing, and he mentioned, you know, we're already working on 2026, so we know exactly what's going to happen in the future on this. But without committing to anything, Dan, just to give a little bit more color on the not scored portion here, like what does that mean moving forward? And you've touched on it a little bit, but just to give a little bit more concrete information.
Well, here's an analogy. Last year we had a new question. Do you have a net zero target? Unscored. So it sat there. It might have come out in 2022. I don't remember. I mean, the pandemic has made time warp for me anyway. So unscored question is first out there, and you're confronted with this. Do we have a target? I don't know. Let's go around. Let's ask around the firm. Do we have one? Should we have one? Right? And it stimulates that kind of conversation. And so then the next year, it might be scored. Right? If it's there, there will be something associated with it at some future point. So I can't say for a fact that it will be in 2026, but I do observe that a lot of the ESG professionals and just, you know, the finance industry in general is a bunch of high achievers. Everybody wants the A. Everybody's competing against everybody for capital. So firms are playing offense now. They're looking at these things and saying, aha, I see the topic, I see the issue, let's get ahead of it. And so let's get our ducks in a row. And we try to give enough time for people to do that so the best in class will shine.
Okay. For those high achievers or overachievers, and if you want to say yes to that question this year, come and see us. There's a lot of stuff that we can do to help, and we'll go into some of the indicators. Before we move to the next slide, I just want to touch on the LEAP framework just to help on the education around this. So TNFD, we talked about the acronym, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. We've talked that GRESB has aligned this particular criteria with that. And the reason that criteria is aligned with TNFD is it's because it's embracing the LEAP framework, which is locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. And we'll go into some of the indicators, but essentially the LEAP framework is that concept of double neutrality and seeing where these individual assets intersect with nature, evaluating, you know, how they are dependent or on nature, how they can impact nature, assessing how they're going to, you know, leverage that, and then prepare. The P is the disclosures and actually the reporting piece. So the LEAP framework ties into TNFD, I guess, is just what I'm trying to say. And GRESB has come out with a criteria that aligns with all of those different frameworks.
Before we advance, Alex, let's stick with this question here for just a second. And let's talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what some of the, okay, you're confronted with this, you're in the institutional investment world, and your job is to deliver returns. Oh, I'm focused on that. I'm not focused on biodiversity. Wow, this is, oh, yikes. What are some of the challenges that you see with the industry, just even confronting this?
Yeah, and I think that's part of one of the conversations we've had, right? Is how does biodiversity actually tie into real estate? And it's some of the conversations we're having with some owners, right? They're saying, you know, I'm a building owner. Why should I care about biodiversity? Not that they don't want to care, but why is it important? Again, I'm there to bring financial returns to my investors. Why is biodiversity important? And the reason it's important, the reason TNFD, the reason COP15, the reason GRESB is aligning now is that, as we said on the top of this call, it's the risk is a financial risk. It's not just an environmental risk. It's if your asset is dependent on nature and suddenly those resources aren't available or the price goes up, or if you're impacting nature in a different way, the concept of kind of stranded assets and assets that are actually negatively impacting biodiversity today don't get fully captured in a transaction. But what TNFD is saying and what GRESB is saying by putting out this criteria is saying, well, over time, we can see investors actually caring about this and actually wanting to make sure that their assets are future-proofed for a future transaction because they're not impacting biodiversity in a bad way. If a building was to come up, you know, or an entity was to come, was to do an assessment and realize that the actual building from we'll take an example of pesticides. If the pesticide policy on site was actually affecting negatively species around that building and was actually harming the communities around that building, that can have a financial risk on that building, be able to transact in the future. And that's why investors are asking this question: is have you captured all of this risk around biodiversity? Because we want to make sure it's showing up in the value of the building. And so a lot of the conversations we're having with our owners or the conversations with our asset managers the question is not necessarily coming from tenants as we would have expected in the, if you had asked me 4 or 5 years ago, it said, oh, well, tenants are going to care about this. All of the questions are coming from investors. They're saying, have you captured biodiversity risk in your ESG strategy? Because we're starting to see this as an important thing that can have financial impact on it.
So I think here's the big aha for a lot of people as you try to wrap your brain around this is we're in the real estate industry. So we think about and we love generally buildings. If you're an institutional investor and you're at one of these really major pension plans, you have a portfolio that covers billions of dollars, right? Some of the biggest pension plans in the United States, 30, 40, 50 billion dollars of real estate. Those are thousands of buildings. So it's not just one building. It's if you can tie all of these, if you can tie all these buildings together through metrics and bring them up to the portfolio, you can start answering questions like, is my portfolio helpful or hurtful to the environment? Because you're looking at 1,000 things in a systematic, structured way. That's the goal here, right? So often, I mean, it's playing out on the ground, but the demand is coming from somebody that's looking across 1,000+ buildings and looking at that overall portfolio and saying, is this a good portfolio? Maybe. It's good for returns, but what about some of these other things? How do we make it better? That's the goal here. That's the goal.
Yeah. And to your point, right, when you start putting those entire portfolios together, you're trying to have a pretty sizable footprint, right? Or just kind of land footprint, right? And so you start seeing if you own 100, 120, 150, or 1,000 assets, well, let's say more than 100, that starts to be a pretty significant footprint. And is that footprint actually positive or negative for nature and biodiversity? The question is as important as is it positive or negative for carbon emissions or all of these other big subjects that have come through on ESG. And that's, I guess, the point we're trying to make today.
Bingo. All right, let's move.
Okay, here are some. So we're going back the RM7. That's the criteria. That's the does the entity have a strategy that addresses biodiversity and nature related issues? As we saw on the slide before, it actually asks, well, does that strategy include impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities? So is it aligned with TNFD essentially? This is the kind of quick some of the indicators that have come out from the TNFD real estate specific guidance. So not not for other industries. This is really for real estate. And I'll try to come through some of the indicators here and just see some of the places that we're going to see real estate owners measure first in terms of getting a sense of baseline. And just for those on the call, like what we're hearing from owners, what we're hearing from people that are, let's say, ahead of the curve in terms of biodiversity is a little bit what we're hearing 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, which was at this particular moment in time, people are not necessarily thinking about how they want to impact positively biodiversity in nature. They want to get a sense of a baseline, a measure, see where they stand, where they have potential risk across their portfolio. So everyone that I'm speaking to anyways, at this point in time, plans to impact positively nature in the future. But at the moment, what are the indicators and how do we kind of benchmark our particular assets versus others? And those indicators, we've listed 5 here just as an example of the big ones that are coming out. Ecosystem extent. So this is when we talked about a second ago, the footprint, right? Like how much actual footprint do you have? How much actual space do you have? So you can have a massive campus with a lot of lawn area, which might be interesting for biodiversity, or you actually might have a very, very small, Manhattan property that has a tiny little footprint. Extent is saying how big that footprint is. And we use geospatial data, so that's satellite imagery to get that. And we use pollinator data because we work across, over 2,000 buildings. We have essentially the biggest database at this point of kind of urban biodiversity across the real estate portfolio. And so extent is that first one. Condition becomes really interesting because it's not necessarily, to take that same example, if you have a massive lawn on a certain campus or a certain big area, doesn't necessarily mean that it's rich in terms of biodiversity. It doesn't necessarily mean that within that particular lawn, you have hundreds or thousands of different species. You can actually have very little. And then if you compare to that Manhattan building, well, you may have a very small ecosystem extent, but a very high ecosystem condition because the diversity in what's happening on that particular plot of land is actually much richer. And so the way we do that, and we've touched on this in the last webinar, but I'll just, for those that weren't there, is we use a technology called eDNA, so environmental DNA. And what we do is because on site, for these buildings will usually have either a beehive or a bee home, which is for wild bees. Those pollinators are collecting hundreds of thousands of samples around that building. They're collecting a lot of stuff that they're coming in contact with, either directly or indirectly, and carry that on their bodies, bring that back inside to their habitat. And when we actually sample the inside that habitat, whether it's a wild bee home or a beehive, we can do this with soil. There's many different ways to do this. If the existing asset doesn't have a pollinator installation, when we sample that and run an environmental DNA analysis on it, we get essentially we get every species that was come in contact with that particular habitat. So we can see very well what's going on in the environment around it, and we can see how rich that environment is or not. Landscape intactness, this is kind of comparing that particular asset to, you know, its original form. So we talk a lot about habitat connectivity. So how does it, you know, connect with other areas around it? How does it compare to that original kind of landscape in terms of biodiversity? Obviously, in a highly, you know, modified space like an urban or a building in an urban center, it's hard to compare to how that was 200 years ago. But the landscape intactness is trying to get that sense. It's trying to see how does it compare, and how does it getting better basically year over year. Species extinction risk is kind of cross-referencing with the IUCN species range map. So again, it's using satellite imagery, so we can see you know, how that particular building or how that particular campus or how that particular portfolio might be interacting with endangered species and what it's doing. We actually ran measurements across a lot of our portfolios here and came up with a vulnerable species that was on one of these sites in New York. And so kind of interesting to see that you're picking up vulnerable species in those samples on site. And then we can do things like plant particular flowers or plant particular landscapes that will help that species once we get that data. So it all becomes about we get that data and how do we, you know, impact things differently. And then my favorite, is pollutants and specifically pesticides. We started this last year of doing pesticide analysis for on-site. To me, this is the lowest hanging fruit that a lot of commercial real estate buildings can do. We have a whole webinar on it that you can go back and reference. But essentially, even a building that doesn't have a big landscape is using a lot of pesticides in kind of rodent control. You know, it could be landscaping, all these different things that go into the, you know, operations or the maintenance of the building. It is so easy to swap some of those chemicals through a basic policy that could fit into a strategy that would, you know, reflect the impact of these risks and opportunities that would actually reduce harmful chemicals that are used across the portfolio to actually benefit biodiversity. So there are these like pretty simple things that could be done at a building that would immediately reduce the risk on biodiversity and automatically or very simply increase the habitat or the forage or the, you know, reduce the harmful chemicals that are on site. So some of the indicators that exist there, just to give you an example that what a kind of commercial real estate building could be doing. Right? Jen, anything to add? Does this convince you or?
Well, no, well, look, the TNFD opening statement, you know, all things go back to Mother Nature. I believe that wholeheartedly. So the difficulty is I own this building. Why do I care? Oh, I know, because I have institutional investors who are trying to look at their entire portfolio. So this becomes, from my perspective, an investor relations issue. And it also becomes, you know, very important for the industry. Land, labor, capital, real estate is critical, not only as an investment vehicle, but also for every company. Every company is an occupier of real estate. So let's use this, you know, let's just help Mother Nature. Let's not be extractive. Let's also be additive is kind of where I philosophically line up. And then it becomes just a communication issue. I do stumble on the metrics. I've just put this link in here in the chat about the metrics that they're looking for. So that's where I thought the industry would struggle with this. Having a strategy is great. So strategy then begets to metrics. So here we are, and that's, I think, how this is going to evolve over the, you know, as the decade matures towards 2030.
Well, Dan, that's a beautiful way to close this webinar with a mix of metrics and philosophical thoughts. So hopefully hopefully it's clear. The biodiversity is an important topic. Hopefully it's clear how that's shaping up into the assessment and what the criteria is. Hopefully it's clear some of the indicators and some of the metrics. Those that are interested in talking about those particular indicators and what they would like to do, we are, this is our shameless plug. We've built a product to do that helps for the sampling, helps for the analysis and benchmarks with other buildings. So come and see us if you're interested in that. The indicators are not from us. That's a TNFD kind of global thing, but the way to actually measure it in a kind of cost-effective way for building, that's kind of where we come in. We'll open up just for Q&A for a second here to see if
And to build, yes, thank you. And to build on that from our perspective, right, GRESB won't make up metrics. We will look to best in class out there around the world. TNFD is that. And so our job is to make them material and tailored for institutional real estate, for infrastructure. And that's what we do. And then put together a framework to allow these structured non-financial data metrics to show up in a way that institutional investors can consume them and advance their portfolios. We had a couple of questions already in the chat, and I think we've given a lot of people some thoughts. So seems like we might have done a good job. I don't know. Or our emails are going to light up, one of the two.
Well, a good follow-up if people aren't putting questions in the chat. Dan and I are going to be at IMN at the ESG conference in Nashville in February 3rd to 5th. So it's coming up in a few weeks. And this is the decarb real estate forum. A lot of ESG folks will be there, and Alvéole will actually be running a roundtable on nature and biodiversity, and specifically kind of TNFD disclosures. And so you'll see Dan and I at that particular event if there's questions that come through, and then RedCon coming also in March in Las Vegas, which will be there, also talking about nature and biodiversity.
Looking forward to it.
Same here. Well, thanks to everyone that joined. Thank you, Dan, for being here and being such a great ambassador for GRESB. And please reach out if anyone on the call today has any questions on biodiversity or nature. We're here to help.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Let's do it. On Teams, I can get an explosion that happens, maybe not on Zoom. Anyway, this has been great, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dan. Talk soon.
All right. Be well, everybody.